Hey, it's one of my favorite superhero movies, Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy 2, The Golden Army. Here's why I like this movie and think it's underrated coming up next. I think Hellboy 2 is underrated. It's only getting like a 7.0 on Letterboxd and IMDb. Those are pretty low for superhero movies. I find this movie is a wonderful sets and costume movie. If nothing else, watch this movie because after 15 years, it still holds up in terms of what you can see, the absolute visual and sonic feast that this movie is. In fact, I might call this a one thing after another movie, kind of like Return of the Jedi, where it's just one thing after the other, the edges of the screen, the interesting creatures on the screen, and so on. To me, that's the reason why you watch this movie. Because the plot is pretty basic. There's a bad elf out there who takes over his father's kingdom. He's going to break the truce with the humans. Humans are greedy. I like this movie's critique of humanity as having a hole in its heart, needing to fill it, and they fill it with greed. So the elves are upset, this elf prince in particular. It's kind of an interesting, maybe a slightly complicated villain, in that he's not just trying to kill everybody because he's a nihilist, but because he actually has a little bit of moral sense about him. This elf prince has a twin. If he gets wounded, she gets wounded, and vice versa. This creates a conundrum because the Hellboy crew working for the government, they're sort of secret government agents, a la the Men in Black series. They're hidden, but they come out in this movie. The paranormal research team becomes public, and of course Hellboy himself, looking like a devil, shaving off his horns, is not going to be taken well in public. Hellboy, of course, is played by Ron Perlman. I think he's funny. He's cranky. He is the guy who makes Deadpool happen. You don't get Deadpool, the sort of snarky superhero figures, without Hellboy, the Guillermo del Toro Hellboys. And in this movie, you have some human interest. Although these aren't human characters, Hellboy is arguing with his girlfriend. Turns out she's pregnant, but she's keeping it a secret from Hellboy. Meanwhile, his fish buddy, Abe Sapien, who I really like and find to be funny, he falls in love with the princess elf, but that's a problem because, one, he's shy, and two, well, her brother is kind of a jerk. So it's up to the Hellboy team to stop this dark prince from releasing a golden army that will kill all humans. Now that plot sounds kind of dumb. It is, though, the staple of a lot of Marvel movie fare, which came after this movie. And that's one of my arguments for this movie. I think Marvel looked at this movie, among many other superhero movies, but this one in particular, and said, hey, this one has a lot of formulaic stuff we can use that'll attract a popular audience. Now, Hellboy 2 and even Hellboy, they're not attractive to look at. I don't think Abe Sapien, no character in this movie, maybe besides a couple, are good looking or fun to look at. So Marvel actually polished that up and made good looking characters. But Del Toro's vision is always darker, and he's going to take things that are ordinary, like tooth fairies, which are happy, they have a nice, pleasant image, and make them seem like terrors or menaces, or at least sort of darkly gothic looking. And I think that's some attraction in this movie. It's like Lord of the Rings combined with steampunk, and you have this dark elf figure who looks more like a vampire to me than a traditional elf or like an elf in Lord of the Rings. And that, I think, has some appeal to it. In that sense, the movie is unusual to look at. I love the sets. I love the costumes. I love the steampunk atmosphere. I love that Del Toro fixates on all the gears and technology that moves and twists and intersects and interlocks in this movie. I just think it's fun to look at and add some texture to the movie. Even though they probably used a lot of CGI here, I know they used real costumes. I know that that's what Del Toro likes to some extent. Real stuff, real things on set, real costumes, a la George Lucas in the Star Wars movies, that changes the look and the feel of the movie to me. And Christopher Nolan at the same time is doing his, photorealism thing with Batman. Del Toro's doing something like that as far as he can with the Hellboy movies, and unfortunately moved into too much CGI for me, which has a thin computerized veneer to it as far as the look and texture of the movie goes. That's one reason I like this movie. I think they should always use real sets and real costumes as a differentiator to video games, for example. Otherwise, movies look too much like video games to me sometimes. I've already mentioned some of Del Toro's influences. There's a Wizard of Oz flair in here with a quote-unquote Tin Man. That's Johann Kraus, who is... I just love this character. I mean, as far as imagination goes, this movie tickles my imagination. Johann Kraus being some kind of misspirit German thing. He's sort of a German scientist, one of those sort of ex-Nazi scientists who come to the USA a la Dr. Strangelove. But he's part of the team. He's called a Tin Man in this movie. And you have a foursome go through and basically go to a Wizard of Oz type place late in the movie. A Golden Army scenario. Well, that's sort of like the Emerald City, I suppose. So this mixture of Gothic, Lord of the Rings, steampunk, Wizard of Oz, and Star Wars has all of its appeal to me as sort of a lover of stuff, science fictional fantasy or science fantasy stuff. That's what the Hellboy series is. At least Del Toro's 2 movies are to me. That's why I like them. On the downside, I feel like the Hellboy character takes a back seat to the sets and the costumes, and he's not as snarky and witty. He is sometimes, and he has those weird quirks like liking cats, but in the first Del Toro Hellboy movie, I think it's more of an interesting dynamic dialogue, snarky dialogue stuff with him and Abe Sapien and others. This movie, there's less of that, although Jeffrey Tambor is in the movie, and he gives it that sort of goofy Arrested Development air, which is maybe part of, all kinds of other superhero fare that come along later, like a couple of the Thor movies, as I said, and Guardians of the Galaxy. Speaking of Guardians of the Galaxy, I mean, if you want a movie that has weird characters who love late 20th century American pop music, this movie did it before Guardians of the Galaxy, and that's what I'm saying. You've got to watch this movie to see how much Marvel took from it. And theft isn't all bad in art, by the way. I'm not criticizing Marvel for doing it, but this movie is one of the few movies, along with maybe the earlier Batmans, that give some ideas to the Marvel franchise that has made billions and billions of dollars by now. And yet, given all the Marvel stuff, I kind of would still take this movie overall, because I think it's more in line with Return of the Jedi, which is my thing, a textural thing for me, with all kinds of weird creatures coming in every scene. I love the tooth fairies in this movie. The troll market is wonderful. Sort of Star Wars cantina thing exploding onto screen. I love the sort of elf backstory and the sort of sewer-like elf kingdom we get here. Hellboy himself, Abe Sapien, definitely Johann Carlos, and everything else. Just as an exciting movie that has visual wonders in it, I just like this movie overall. That's why I think it's better than what people are rating it. But I think if people are looking at the story and character and they're rating it that way, I can see why they might lower this movie overall compared to other sort of superhero fare. But if I were making a fantasy movie, and I really mean this would be like one of maybe 2 or 3 movies that I would look at very carefully and closely, analyze, think about how they made it, in order to make my own. And I would probably steal from Del Toro here. I did watch it with my 9-year-old who loves monster movies, and he said, hey, there's a little too much fighting in this. And I thought, I don't know that you're right about that. I kind of like the fighting, although there's a lot of shots of elves jumping around using swords, maybe a few too many. Some of those could be cut. But other than that, I don't mind the one thing after another aspect of this movie. I actually quite dig it, as you can see. Now, what do you think of this Hellboy 2? Maybe the first Hellboy by Del Toro? Let us know in the comments. How does it compare to superhero fare or other kinds of fantasy movies? Let us know. Please subscribe to this channel for more great content. Thank you. Have a great day.